So, one of the things that I was trying to figure out is how you decided who got to play what. So, one of the really interesting things that happens at the very last section of the piece is it's the first time that they actually have distinct character. Although, of course, the weird thing about it is that you're locked. So, you're actually playing this very lush thing that's repeated, and the supposed machines are actually changing. So there is some kind of paradoxical thing going on there. But I wondered if you could say something about how you looked at their relationship, the relationship of the live versus the technological.
I don't even. I Good question. I don't know if I have an answer exactly because for all the system that I have going on, that I try to put behind me when I sit down to write music, and for whatever reason, this piece was all these dense patterns that were very closely related, right? Like a lot of this kind of motion, a lot of things in sync with electronics, and then somehow it just needed to do some. It needed to go somewhere else at the end, and I think like this was sort of a more emotional piece for me, and maybe that's where it kind of shows through a little bit more or something. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of my music has a lot of material similar to what was going on until the end, and then the end kind of really felt like something different. I don't know. So I sort of didn't answer your question in a way, but I don't know. I don't know exactly where that came from.
It definitely felt different. Um, so do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I guess like it kind of reminds me. Maybe this has no relationship at all, but correct me if I'm wrong. But it kind of reminds me of like the early Glass like keyboard works where. Oh, sorry. I was saying that the effect of it creating an environment which is the stasis for a very long time, and you become completely immersed in that world, and then all of a sudden taking it away um, puts a spotlight on kind of the human side and the emotion, and it's very powerful, and it's left right at the very end. And I was saying that it kind of reminds me of some early Philip Glass keyboard works where a lot of the repetitions don't happen until after the the patterns have been established, and then once the patterns start moving, um, it is just magical. It's almost psychedelic, but you need all of that beforehand to set it up.
I think a lot of the way those pieces work, and I think it is a little bit this way also, is that it feels sometimes that a huge amount of time is spent sort of changing your metabolism so that you can finally, kind of get to the magic of the relationship of it. And I think those Glass pieces work that way for me. Um, this piece is also really hard, as I'm sure you know. You should know it's really hard. Um, so, what what is it like also for you to be sort of doing these mechanical things, which they can play without any effort, and which the point of it, I think, a lot of is, your humanity comes out of the effort of you trying to do them.
Um, yeah, I guess it's almost like for me, it's just kind of a fun game for me. Like it's just exploration of, well, is it possible to actually try and take the human element out of playing music, and seeing how far that can go to see if you can eliminate that. And so in various sections in this piece, I find it very fun to interact with the different parts of the one bit, because it's been utilized. The relationship between the piano part and the one bit changes throughout, and sometimes I feel like I'm trying to imitate it, and I feel sometimes the one bit is trying to have take on a more human form or more emotion, successful or not. And for me, I'm trying to do that too sometimes. So it's kind of I don't know if I'm successful or not, but I think it's fun to kind of explore that area. And I think in all aspects of. We're in a room of a lot of different thinkers. Various topics, many of them that I don't know about, but I think we all delight in the exploration of these things that we want to think about and see if it's possible, at least.
Yeah, I'll also add that my background musically is as a pianist. I studied piano, and I didn't write piano music for a long time leading up to this piece, actually. So kind of a lot of things went into it, but the electronics, for me, everything kind of comes from the piano, and my whole interest in electronics, in a weird way, does too. Because when you think about, like, the piano is a discrete instrument. The pitches are separate. There's this finite number of predefined pitches, and you trigger them. They're sort of on or off, more or less. It's a kind of discrete event-based instrument, and you play it with your digits, your fingers, and there's a connection there to digital information, to computation as a sequential thing where there's a step, and there's nothing really in between. And it's very different from instruments that are based on more continuous processes, like bowing a violin string, where you're setting something into vibration on a very kind of granular level, and you have a nuanced control over that. The piano is this more digital thing, and so the technology is related, and the electronic parts, they all come kind of from the same compositional process that for me originates out in the piano. So as even though they're performed by chips and with this precision and this kind of the clock of the chip on these chips is 16 megahertz, so that's 16 million divisions per second, and we have a very, very finely tuned sense of time, but it's not that fine. So it's about kind of finding this meeting ground, I guess, too.
Have we any questions?
Just a quick question out of curiosity. Could you show us those boards that are creating those sounds, what the setup actually looks like, what these
Sure.
things are?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Everything is powered off. This particular piece has 7 of these boards, and each one has 6 small microcontrollers, and it takes a sync pulse from a master chip, and then there's 6 jacks and 6 transistors which step the 1-bit signal up from the digital out from the chip to something that can power these speakers, because speakers are motors, they're linear motors, and they're essentially taking the voltage output of the chip and converting it into movement, and then you oscillate that at a certain audible frequency and it creates sound. And so, like, these a speaker is just a membrane connected to an electromagnet, and I think of speakers are a lot like drums in a way. It's like, a drum has a membrane on the front, but instead of hitting the drum, a speaker kind of allows you to sort of reach underneath and, like, control the membrane sort of phantomly, like, and make it do whatever you want, whatever signal you give to it. So I love speakers. There's this class of objects that have a very direct translation between electricity and something else. So speakers are like that. There's a very direct connection between electricity and movement and sound. And old TVs, like before LCD TVs, have also a very direct connection of, like, electron gun shooting out electrons that hit a scintillation screen, essentially, and that becomes light. And we don't have so much of that kind of technology anymore around us. So, thanks. No, don't worry.
Is there any variability between Vicky's playing and the 1-bit output, other than human error? Or to put it differently, in tomorrow night's performance, subject to human variation, will it sound the same?
This is a very prescient question for tonight's performance, because after many performances now where everything goes according to plan, one of the speakers got offset. I'm so sorry, Vicky. She's doing such an amazing job up here. And the electronics, I mean, you could probably tell in the last section, this sort of errant melody came in. And then it resurfaced at the very end for a moment when it should otherwise be stasis. So sometimes these things happen, and it's mostly due to me being an amateur electrical engineer. And if anybody knows much about capacitors and that kind of stuff, please see me after the show. And, I've got some 10 microfarads and some 100 microfarads on there, and maybe they're not enough. But actually, machine error I think is really cool too. And besides, when like Vicky talks about how every performance she hears something different in the electronics, and the room, the way the speakers project and reflect, their proximity to her gives her a different impression, which makes her respond differently in the balance of the piano and the electronics. But oh yeah, sorry, it's a totally pre-written score. It's not generative at all. The electronics are supposed to play the same notes every time. And the last thing I was going to say is in machine error, these drawings that I have out front, there's one of them that kind of has a skewed shape and some lines that go down from it. And that was because the drawing machine that I have, which is a very simple apparatus, would sometimes get offset. And it was kind of like these magical moments that I didn't want to program in kind of these errors, but once in a while that would happen, and it would make those drawings really unique. Right? It's like the moments when the thing that's supposed to go perfectly correct doesn't, and you really can't. You have no idea when that's going to happen. You have no idea if it's going to be productive or something you don't want. And so I love those moments. Anyway.
What microcontrollers do you use, and what do you program them with? What
I
language?
love these questions here. So these are Atmel AVR microcontrollers. They're an 8-bit instruction set processor, and it's all programmed in assembly language. I used to work in C, and then I realized that the way I structure my code, it's very modular and represents itself very nicely in assembly. So I started doing that largely to optimize for these processors to get more, so like a higher sample rate, for instance, from it. And I just kind of fell in love with working on computation on that level. And there's a book that I made out front. It's called 0.01 seconds, and it's about this thick. It's 600 pages, and it's a log of the microcontroller in this other piece I have, 1-Bit Symphony, which is the one that is in the program notes David writes about. And that processor is running at 8 megahertz, so it's 8 million instructions per second, and in 0.01 seconds it executes 80,000 instructions. And I formatted those really small and printed that in this book. And it's sort of like this document of what's happening, and the assembly instruction is being executed and the registers that change. And the piece for me, the reason I did it is I wanted to just like represent how much information is how much is going on in these chips. And these are like an 8 megahertz chip is 1,000 times slower than what we're using these days. So 1,000 of those books go by, and then 100 times that every second. And it just shows us, I think, like just how out of touch we are with electronics, and just like how ridiculously fast these are, even the slow ones. So, yeah.
So you were talking about the speakers and the connection between the electricity and the speakers and the drums of the speakers. What about the other drums? And how do you protect your ears, and how do you decide the loudness? Toward the end there, I found it painfully loud.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I was concealing this well or not, but I always try to make it hidden. But I am wearing an earpiece for both purposes, I guess. It's kind of protecting my ears. Sometimes the placement of the speakers, depending on the space, varies. And on this space, it is a couple of them are directly behind me. And this is also a little guide, a little map for me too. So I know where I am in the piece. So I didn't want to give away the secret, but so. Or do you want to say?
Maybe I'll just add.
Not computer
No.
question. When you during performance, are all the speakers pre-programmed and Vicky just plays along, or does she control the volumes of each one? Does she have control during the performance of all these loudspeakers, or is it just given and she plays along? And her performance is then fixed a little bit.
Yeah, Vicky's just playing along. Yeah, no, it's yeah, that's I like it that way, and I think it keeps the roles very well defined, and so you know that Vicky's playing the score and the electronics are doing their thing and they're meeting in space. It's not like it's a reactive piece. I'm trying to keep the technology extremely reserved, and it's not really doing anything very special. It's just kind of playing this music I wrote in the same way, supposedly every time.
I guess, do I play it the same every single time? I guess that's the element. I guess I'm the wild card, actually. Well, yes and no, but.
No, definitely, yeah, and every, you make different decisions every performance. I'm very aware of that, like the shaping you do, and it's interesting just to see the continued development of a performer playing the same piece over a number of years, like smallest little differences. I'm interested in these sort of like, you make a small change and it opens up a whole new body of work, and I hear that, like, and it changes the character of an entire section. And it keeps the piece changing for me, definitely, every time I hear you play it.
So in continuation to that question, what if, or have you tried to establish some kind of a feedback loop between Vicky and the electronic?
No, I've thought about it, and I keep saying kind of no, but I like to leave things open for maybe, who knows? Like as a composer, I feel like I want to leave all the doors open, and who knows, the things that I don't want to do now or the things I want to do later. Like, I was very anti-electronics as a student. When I first met you, I was like, I don't want to do anything with electronics. And it wasn't until I started working with these that all of a sudden electronic sound like meant something, like the same way these instruments, like it kind of took on this tactile quality, and then everything changed, and now every single piece I do has electronics, and it's hard to get away, almost. So, but yeah, so we'll see.